from there to here. But we're going to start on time anyway, because we have a streamed group as well. So, well, first of all, let me say a warm welcome to this fascinating topic on talent and the retention of talent. Let me just say a little bit by way of briefing why this is such an important issue for us to be talking about right now. I mean, I don't need to tell you, you're here at the World Economic Forum, that there are many problems that we're facing, particularly around the labour market. The pandemic has had a very tough impact on people's health, on people's views about how they want to work. At the same time, we have economic and political volatility. And that means that in many developed countries of the world, there are significant labour shortages. I don't know if we'd have expected that at this stage, but that's where we are now. And to give you a sense of that, in the US in November 22, there were 10 million vacancies. Now, that's not just a US figure, by the way. In Europe, 3 in 10 manufacturers say that the lack of labour is creating productivity constraints. In fact, back to the US, in the US manufacturing sector, 1.4 million people left their jobs and have not returned to it. The same, by the way, is true in the UK. So the challenge of attracting and retaining talent could never have been more important. Now, one of the things I teach my MBA students, I'm a professor at the London Business School, is that many of these big complex issues are solved with multi-stakeholders. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that on the panel today, we have representatives of all the major stakeholders in the play that says, how do we attract and retain talent? Let me, just before I introduce the panel, just say that this is part of an ongoing conversation within the World Economic Forum on the issues of skills and talent. And I know a number of you are actively involved in that. But I also just want to draw your attention to the Good Work Framework, which has been created as a way of thinking about what would good work look like. And this has come out of a long consultative process within the WEF. And we're going to be talking about it, at other stages. So where are we in terms of multi-stakeholders? Well, certainly governments play a role. And you can see right across the world that some governments are playing a very active role, both in terms of signalling and upskilling. Organizations themselves play a role because it's they who are custodians of human capital in terms of attracting. We know that recruitment platforms are an enormously important intermediary between the worker and the employer. And we know that advocacy groups play a very crucial role in advocating for particular parts of our society. So first, let me introduce you to our panel. Let me start by introducing Secretary Martin J. Walsh, who's the Secretary of Labour of the United States. Let me then introduce Joanne Jenkins, who is the Chief CEO of the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired People, and has, by the way, 38 million people in its membership. May I introduce Hisayuki Idekoba? I'm going to call him Deco from now on, who is President and CEO of Recruitment Holdings, one of the largest recruitment platforms in the world, based actually in Austin, Texas, and finally, based in Lisbon, or Porto, in fact, one of the most beautiful places in the world, by the way, Claudio Azevedo, who is the CEO of Sonai, a Portuguese-based organization, but with offices in 50 places around the world. So that's our panel for today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm first of all going to ask a question of each of our panelists. I'm then going to, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to open up to questions. And we will be closed at 1:45. So that's how the session is going to run. Secretary Walsh, the question that I'd like to ask you as a starter is really in terms of the retention of people, and that's really a key part of the labour market dynamics. There is a quit rate in the US up until very recently, which went as high as 3%. So 3% of people quitting on an annual basis. And although that's gone down a little bit, it still remains high. And of course, that has huge implications on organizations and indeed on the labour markets that we think about. Secretary Walsh, what role do you think government can play in issues like quit rates?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's great to be here today. I want to thank all the panelists that are here. I want to thank you for coming this morning. I think that, the quit rate conversation really has begun in 2021, 2022, more so in 2021, obviously really led by the pandemic and problems. And I think that ultimately, and I'll get to the question in a second, the economy in the workplace is very different than when my father was a worker. When my father was a worker, and my mother and our parents and the older generation, they would work for one or two or maybe three companies in their entire career. And when they got there, they'd stay there, through the good and the bad, however it was, whatever the salary was, they took it. The pandemic, when it hit, particularly the United States of America, 10.5 million people were let go pretty much in a matter of 2 weeks. Those folks had 6 months to really think about. There was unemployment benefits that were extended by Congress. And there was also, when the President Biden became president, the American Rescue Plan had a little bit of extension there as well. I think a lot of people were thinking during the pandemic that they were looking for better employment. They realized that they were either overworked, underpaid, didn't have the skills they needed. And I think when people started to come back to work, they went back into work that they weren't satisfied with, and they quit because there's other opportunities and other options. And I think that's still the case today to some degree. There's still more job openings in the U.S. than people eligible for them. So there's opportunities for people to kind of move around if they will. I think government has a big role to play in recruitment and retention, but it has to be a partnership. I was talking a minute ago to Mr. Lynch, and we were talking about recruitment a little bit in our meeting. And a lot of it is on the list that you had up there earlier. Yeah. What are the offers for companies? What are they doing? Companies are starting to look at paid sick leave. They're starting to look at paid time off. They're looking at how do we do a hybrid model, which works, and some of the folks on the panel will talk about it here. How does the hybrid model work? When I became the Secretary of Labor, we were thinking about what the future of work looks like, and we're having this conversation. And I don't think it's a role for government to tell companies how to run their companies, but I do think it's a role for government to look at best practices and share those best practices with companies that might want them. And I really think that's important. I spent a lot of time meeting businesses in America. I was in New York City. I did a visit to Wall Street, all the big companies there. And it was interesting, one of the companies I talked to wanted people in the office 5 days a week and really pushing the 5 days a week. And I talked to another financial institution that said it's a 4-day-a-week work week where an individual could pick a day off. And the productivity got higher in that company, and the retention rate was better in that company. And when you have better retention, you don't have the high quits. And I think that that's an opportunity. I also think, the last thing I'll say, as companies, you have an opportunity to take advantage of the quit rate, if you will. When people leave companies, to get them in your company to recruit them. So, I think it's going to change as it moves forward. Seems to be getting more stable right now. The work environment, better wages is obviously helping. Flexibility is helping. And companies that have really understood that for their business model now are being successful.
Of course, one of the interesting things about this challenge that we're speaking about is there are so many differences across countries. Yeah. So, for example, something like paid sick leave would be a norm in much of Europe. Yeah. And I'd like us to explore some of that in this panel, because in terms of best practice, one can learn both from companies within a country, but also from other countries, and so that's really why I want the next panelist I want to bring in here is is really to talk about this question of what have we learned? You know, when we take a look across the whole of the workforce around the world, and Deco, your platform has probably more access to what's happening in job openings and how they're working than many others. And I know the data that you've got has already been used by governments around the world. What are you seeing that actually shows any differences between countries when it comes to things like quit rate and mobility?
I think the reshuffling or great resignation or whatever people are talking about, we have been seeing that kind of situation all around the world. And Recruit is our global leader in HR technology and business solutions. We are parent to Indeed.com and Glassdoor.com, which welcome 300 million people each month. And we're also a parent to one of the largest staffing agency businesses. So we have a unique data set and a unique view on global labor market. And what we have been seeing is reshuffling, but when we look deeper into details, we saw kind of a little bit different situations. For example, in the US, different industries facing different challenges. On one hand, leisure and hospitality continue to be a major source of job gains. It was actually 30% of job growth in last December in our data. And on the other hand, we saw noticeable pullback of tech industry. Software development job posting decreased 34.3% year on year last month, December. So, and also when we think about the size of job loss and unemployment rates in the places like in the US, EU, and Japan, that also we can see a little bit different situations. For example, in the US, as Secretary said, almost 10 million people lost jobs due to the pandemic, compared to 2.6 million in the EU area, despite EU having larger population. And actually, unemployment rate in the EU area has been relatively stable. It reached 6.8% in April 2020, and it peaked 7.8% in August 2020, and it's coming down to 6% now. And in the US, it shot up like 14.7% in April 2020, and it's settling back to 3.5% now. And actually in Japan, we saw 1 million job loss due to the pandemic, but unemployment rate has been almost flat for the last 3 years. And people started to talk about reshuffling, redesignation, labor shortage, whatever. But even in 2019, our data, and we have been seeing the labor shortage. Employers are facing challenges to hire people like nurses, plumbers, and the car technicians or trucking drivers, these kind of jobs. Younger generations don't want to do these kind of jobs. They think these jobs are too tough or not cool. And
is that true for nurses?
I don't know, but it seems it's not popular.
Gosh.
But we know these jobs are essential for communities or societies and economies. But most of developed countries don't have a good plan to build a good pipeline for years ahead.
Yeah.
And,
that's really fascinating, and thank you so much for providing that sort of global perspective. Secretary Walsh made two sort of really interesting comments, and Joanne, I'm going to ask you to sort of respond in your answer as well. One is about governments really work best in partnerships, and then the second one was one of the roles of government is to share best practice. Now, I know, Joanne, for you, it's been a really frustrating time because we've seen this incredibly tight labour market. I mean, tighter than anyone could imagine. And yet, at the same time, we know that 78% of older workers, some of you in the room would probably go into that category, I certainly would, in the US say that they have experienced age discrimination. And I know that AARP have tried so hard to encourage companies to employ, and when we say old, we're not talking about 70, by the way, we're talking about the over 55s. I know.
Actually, the age discrimination is over 40.
It's over 40?
So in the
oh my
US.
goodness, that's even more. So Joanne, what have you, that's really the question I wanted to ask, really, coming back to Secretary Walsh's point. I mean, what do you think is good practice, and what would you like to see companies doing?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think it's so important that we don't judge people by how old they are. That we judge them about the talent and the wisdom and the skill sets that they bring to the workforce. And as has been discussed on the panel here, I think what we see with our members is an increasing participation and wanting to either continue to work in the workplace because they have to, because of financial reasons, or because that's what brings them meaning and purpose in life, and they continue to work. Having said that, we have seen an uptick, particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, of the amount of claims, filings on age discrimination, with larger amounts of people saying they've experienced some type of age discrimination in the workplace to be able to do that. And so, some of the things that we do at AARP, because I always make it a practice that we don't advocate for anything that we're not willing to do ourselves for our own employees. And so I know at AARP we have 4 to 5 generations in the workplace at one time, from 18-year-olds to 80-something-year-olds. We see that having that multi-generational workforce produces better outcomes. As you said, there are certain kind of job categories that older people feel comfortable in, as we talked about in a lot of the conversations we had at WEF this week, particularly in the healthcare space. We know that people who work in healthcare space is 2/3 female, and most of them are over the age of 50, and yet there is still an enormous shortage in the amount of people who are working in that healthcare space, whether it's a care provider or a nurse or practitioner, someone working in the healthcare industry. And so, we want to make sure that jobs and talent, that we think about talent acquisition as we would any other business imperative, that you're looking at some of the things that you had up on your slide about purpose and mission. People work where they want, particularly the younger generation, work at places where they find meaning and purpose. There is second, a continuous learning environment, and it may not be in the job that they're in, but there is an opportunity for people to continue to learn and perhaps be preparing for another type of job. As the Secretary said, most people are going to have 3 to 4 different careers, unlike our parents who probably worked in the same industry their whole lifetime. That people want flexibility. At AARP, we all work at home Mondays and Fridays, and then we're all in Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And then there's some flexibility within that. That alone has made a huge difference in people wanting to come to work. And we know that the people we serve are 38 million plus, but over 110 million people in the U.S. who have people who are over the age of 50. We know that they see that issue of loneliness and isolation, and so our role is being out there in community and being in contact with people. We know that people who are not lonely live 7 to 8 years longer than those who do or who are lonely. And so having those kind of built in, and then I'll just finish out that, and then salary. Salary is sort of fourth on that list now when it used to be number one pre-pandemic. And so I often look at this as, no, it's not the Great Resignation, it's the Great Reflection, that a lot of people stepped back during COVID and after COVID to say, is this what I really want to do? With such a tight labor market, if I'm going to change careers or do something different, this is the time for me to make that adjustment. And I think that, corporations, companies, organizations who take that acquisition and talent management serious will end up hiring a better employee and also get better outcomes in the workplace and higher returns on investment.
Yeah, it seems to me, coming back to the initial point that Secretary Walsh made, that in terms of sharing best practice, I think if we in this panel were to say what the best practices are, and you've just done a fantastic job, Joanne, of actually describing what those are, and it fits very well with the work that the WEF have been doing. But the challenge is, why is it that only some companies do that? Why is it only some companies really? Could government play more of a role there? And so, Claudia, I want to ask you about that, because I know your company has been very much at the forefront of thinking about this. When you thought about what you could do with regard to some of the measures that Joanne has described, why did you do it? And why, when you look at other CEOs, do you think they're not doing it?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that the way you view an issue sort of frames your thinking and your actions, right? And the way we view it is that companies don't compete with companies. People compete. And people are strategy. And we all know the difference in companies when you have a very good invested person engaged doing their job and not doing their job. So if you think of that as it is, then you think of your people in a very different frame. You were talking about the stakeholders. And a lot of companies, a lot of people view the employees as one of the many stakeholders, and it's probably not like that. It's not like the traditional, human capital inputs. And so when you view that what you need is highly engaged people that perform well, the whole organization works for that. You take a long time, you take a lot of time sometimes in organizations to look at the markets and dynamics, and not a lot of time to look inside and have the same effort that you should put outside, looking at your employees and say, how can we have a contract here between both of us that makes you highly engaged, highly performance, and because that's what the company wants. And it's not all bells and whistles. It's not all hybrid. It's a lot more profound than that, giving a job that makes sense to everybody.
Do you think, and maybe, do you think that the ownership structure of the organisation makes any difference to that? I'm thinking about yours being a family firm, family-owned firm, second generation. Second. Do you think that it's been easier for you to think about human capital in the long term than maybe a company that's very short term with a different ownership structure? Just when you look at other different, what do you think about that?
I think we have the best of both worlds because we're listed on the stock exchange and we have the family that owns 50% of it, so we have the best of both worlds. And I think it's true. We look at it as a long-living company. And so we have a long-term goal. We know that our objective is to leave the next generation better off. But I don't think it's incompatible with having just a public or a listed company. But it's true that when you take a decision and the way that you treat people and the way that you try to engage with them is you're there for the long run, and hopefully people are more engaged.
Secretary Walsh, when you talked earlier about sharing best practice, is there anything more, do you think, that a government can do in terms of persuasion?
I mean, I don't think a government's role is to tell companies how to run their companies. First of all, I don't think companies will listen, number one. and number two, I mean, I don't know if the trust is there. But I think that as we were thinking about the future of work at the Department of Labor a few months ago, the team was thinking about the future of work when it came to benefits and what that looks like. I was thinking about what do we do when we get beyond the pandemic. And I think to your question earlier, I think it really is about the business model. It's about the management of the company. Whether it's about if they're a year ago there was a big push to recruit and retain people. I don't know if that urgency is still there today. But it was there a year ago. And I think the companies that are smart, that the leaders of those companies that are smart, that understand that they don't want to go through that again by having to retrain or reskill the workers and have this revolving door, we'll do more to keep people.
Yeah.
And I think that as I go around talking to CEOs of companies, I haven't really done it this week here yet, but I intentionally go around and meet with businesses, and I just hear what their practices are, and I try to share those practices with companies, other companies, if they're willing, if they want to know about it. There's been a lot of buzzwords: great quit, great resignation, or whatever it is, quiet quits. I mean, there's other stuff. I mean, a lot of these were made up terms, and I like what you said. It's true. People reflected. I mean, during the pandemic, I was the mayor of Boston. I would be home at night because I didn't have any events to go to, and I did a lot of reflecting myself about what's next. And I think a lot of us thought about during the pandemic, what's next for me? Like, am I going to keep being the mayor? Am I going to run for something else? Am I going to do this? Am I going to do that? And I think a lot of people had that time for reflection. And honestly, and they also had family time for the first time in a long time. Their phones weren't buzzing. They were having dinner at a normal hour like everyone else. So I think companies have to take all that into account.
Yeah, and if I could add, Linda, I was going to say, I think also what we saw was that the business structure does make a difference. We made a deliberate decision, my management team and I, not to lay off folks, but to realign them to roles that have been created because of the pandemic, to focus on telehealth and telemedicine, on technology training, to coordinate volunteers that were virtual volunteers. But that paid off with people not leaving our organization and going to others when they had opportunities to do that. And I think that sort of shows that, spirit of community within the AARP workforce, that, hey, we cared about them and we took that upon, whereas if I were in a private sector, I probably could have easily cut 20% of the workforce just to cut during that 3-year period and then hire people back. But again, having to retrain and onboard new people all over again is at a much higher cost than it was in keeping people on staff.
That's absolutely the case,
Just the pandemic also in Europe, people stayed working. They got paid. In America, we laid them off. And I think when we talk about sharing best practices, right now, what I'm doing as in labor is looking at the apprenticeship model in Europe because it works to prepare workers. So again, it's about taking the ideas that are happening, and I think that the challenges that we're all facing, I think the business people here in this room, some of you are thinking, well, I don't have a great quits, I don't have a resignation, I don't have I don't have all this stuff going on. So it's been very different the way we handle the pandemic. You're right. I mean, I didn't lay anyone off in City Hall either. I mean, I could have laid off bus drivers, things like that. Other places did. Now they're having problems because they were bus drivers, they were making a little over minimum wage, and they found other jobs, and now they're having problems. So again, that's about how do you treat your workers.
Before I'm going to open for questions in a moment, but before I do that, Deke, I wanted to give you an opportunity because you've talked about the level you've talked about the data at the level of the macro data around countries. But if you look at company-based data, do you see, coming back to the question I asked Claudia, do you see there's any reason why some companies seem to be better at retaining than others? I mean, what do you think are some of the key aspects there?
Yeah, I think, I was actually, taking the data, but 10 years ago in the US, just 4% of job postings had a salary information. So 10 years ago, people were applying jobs even they didn't know how much they were going to get. So, but now it's 80%. And of course, California and New York, governments are forcing to disclose it. But I think transparency is becoming to be a very important thing. If you are running a bad company, bad atmosphere, bad management, you cannot hide it now. People are checking company reviews or CEO reviews. So good companies can survive better and they can retain workers.
So where are we with this conversation? Well, we've looked at the importance of sharing best practice. We've thought about some significant differences actually across countries in terms of the labour market strategies and indeed what companies are doing. We've looked at some groups like the over 55s or the over 50s who are not being represented adequately. And we've looked at, from Claudia's perspective, about how do you build a company that's doing the things that we know make a significant difference to retention. I want to open up to the group now, because we still have a little bit of time. Now this, by the way, is a single sentence question. These are not observations, much as we would love to hear observations. This isn't the moment for them. So only put your hand up if you're prepared to ask a single yes. And do you want to say who you are?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lauren Shum. I'm actually from Boston, so hello, Mayor.
How are you?
My question is, for all the panelists, how have you considered the gender aspect of attracting talent? And the little preface to it is, there's 50 years of U.S. Census data that demonstrates that the more women enter industry, the lower the salary goes. And as you mentioned, salary is...
Yeah, that's Claudia's work, yeah.
Maybe not the primary concern, no, but flexibility is, and often women take jobs that are greater flexibility because whether this should be or not, they are still taking on the greater house care burdens.
Yeah.
And sometimes these jobs that are higher flexibility are lower salary. So I'm just curious about the gender aspect.
And that's a very good observation, and it's absolutely held out by data, which is as a profession becomes feminized, the salary goes down. Let's hear the second question before because that's a great question, isn't it? Yeah. What's our second question? And if anybody, does anyone else have a question? No?
Hi, I'm Dr. Rai of the Values Compass and the BBC, and I know Linda very well, so thank you for this opportunity, Linda. My question was that each of you, from your perspective, from your own perspective, do you use values to attract young talent? And if so, which one have you found to be most important to them?
Okay, those are two great questions. Thank you. Shall we look at the gender question first? You know, as you say, how does that? We haven't really spoken about gender as part of this panel, but there may be something that a number of you would want to comment on. Who would like to start?
I'll start.
That. Yeah.
I was going to say, so we are very fortunate that we have a female CEO. Our board chair is a female, and 60% of my leadership team is female. And I think
are they well paid?
They are.
Is it a feminized workforce that is paid less?
I think they're top of the salary line in the nonprofit sector. So I'll leave it there. Having said that, we know that women are the first ones to be a caregiver for our young generation as well as older. They're the first ones who are going to take out or leave the workforce to take care of some issue at the home. And so that allows, that takes away from them paying into their 401k or their pension program. And so we need to make sure that we're tracking. We do equity studies at AARP across all of our salary grades to make sure that there is no disparities in job or in sex or sexual orientation, and sort of going through on that. And I think that's very important, because if in fact we're going to have equality of salaries for both male and female, we need to make sure that we're keeping track of that.
Thank you. But the more profound point you also make is that feminized jobs like caregiving tend to be lower paid jobs. Yeah. Claudia, you wanted to jump in.
Can I take the values question?
Oh,
sorry.
Why not?
Take
the values question. Go on.
No, I think that the values, people have to value how authentic your company is, because we've seen now in the couple of last weeks that people are being fired a lot in huge quantities and in very
most extraordinary ways.
Yes, in
the panel were
ways.
talking about their experience before we came in, and I probably, with Chatham House rules, can't tell you any of the things they said, but there's some pretty awful things happening right now in terms of people being fired.
So with companies that maybe 6 months ago said they had huge values and they value, and then suddenly they fire everybody, 10,000 people or 5,000 people on Zoom calls or whatever, and so the values have to be there. They have to be authentic. And I think you have to, it's like a minimum standard to work in a company. And I think that is, in our case at least, that works a lot as attracting. It's not to pay less, it's not to do, it's just like a minimum that to be decent. And we're talking about laying off people. And it also helps me as a CEO when we had the lockdown. For me it was very easy to say, I'm not going to lay off anybody. Because I know that's the values that will be there, and they've been there for 50 years and will be there for the next 50 years. So
Yeah.
the value question is, I think people abuse it in forms that are sometimes not authentic. And
Secretary
the
Walsh.
pay equity question. I think a couple things. Number one is in Boston, 51% of households are led by women. And when you have a gap in pay equity, you have a problem with poverty, maybe, in situations of raising a family. That's the big issue when it comes to pay equity. Secondly, in the city as well, billions of dollars in lost revenue in that pay equity question. And if you take that across 50 states in the United States of America and maybe across the globe, that's hundreds of billions of dollars of lost revenue that could be re-entered into the economy, something that's also an issue. Childcare, lack of childcare. When I say 51% of women lead the household in the city of Boston, that means childcare is really important to them because they are the primary breadwinner in that family, earner in that family. So you have to really think about that. This has come up now in my conversations today 4 times of pay equity with women, and it's a big issue. And one thing I always say, when I was a legislator, I voted on pay equity I think 4 or 5 times, and that's great. It's time to stop voting on it. It's pretty basic. CEOs in this room pay the women the same as you pay a man. It's that simple. You don't need legislation to say it. Do an assessment. When I was mayor, I went back and did an assessment because as I was talking about this through my Office of Women's Equity in Boston, advancement in Boston, I said to my office and they said, well, we got to do a pay equity study to make sure we're on par. Most of the employees are unionized, so there's not a problem in the unionized employees. So we found out there was an issue in pay equity. So what we did was we fixed it right away. And right before I left mayor of Boston, I think it was in 2019, I did another study. And the CEO came into my office, and it was a great thing. She goes, we have a problem. I said, what, the pay equity's out of whack because women are being paid more than men. And I'm like, that's a good problem to have. I'll take that. But my point is, it's a huge issue, and it has to be addressed. And it has to be addressed in a real way. At the Department of Labor and Department of Commerce, we launched in the Department of Labor something called the Good Jobs Initiative. And that's making sure that we take an all-of-government approach to make sure the investments that are being made by the federal government, that they're being equitable across the board, that women, people of color, are getting paid the same as white men. And that's one piece of it. There's a whole bunch of other pieces. So we are taking that very serious on a federal level. The president has made a priority. The vice president has made a priority. So we are taking it serious. But we can fix the government side of it, but it really, the bigger issue is in the private sector. I think it's important. And on the other question, if you don't mind, not so much in this job because the process of hiring people is so different, but in my old job, I think it's important to, what I used to do with young talent is let them know that they have an opportunity to move up into the organization. And you recruit young people into the organization. I'd start them in whatever level they were in city government. And in my 7 years as mayor, many of my internal promotions were done from young people that started at an entry-level position that became managers of different folks in City Hall, in different departments, I should say. So it was. I just think that respecting employees and respecting young people, they want to be part of a system. And if you just let them know that if they work hard, they have an opportunity, and they see other people advance, then that promotes a lot of goodwill and a lot of happiness in the workforce.
Yeah, that comes back to your point, Claudia, doesn't it? Because authenticity is about seeing how people are behaving. Teko, I wondered if there's either one of those questions that you wanted to jump into.
Yeah, so the pay equity thing, we have been checking our subsidiaries' pay equity. Actually, the measurement is one challenge in many countries. Many different countries have different situation. So first challenge is the measurement, and I'm sure most of small businesses don't have a good measurement. But for sure, most of companies have uncomfortable fact that pay equity is not great. And so the next challenge will be the transparency again. So I think what we can do as a private company is to ask people to be more transparent, and even if it's not a comfortable reality or fact, I think we need to start from the measurement and being more transparent. That's the only way to fix these challenges.
One thing we did in Boston, we did something called the 100% talent compact, where we get 200, it was 100, we ended up getting 200 plus of the largest companies in the city of Boston to give us their pay data anonymously, and we did an assessment. And what, ironically, as they gave the data, they were part of the conversation, they started to deal with the issue of pay equity in their own firms because they realized that there was a pay equity. Because a lot of people don't know the pay equity is there. They're not searching the data. So they gave us the data, and then all of a sudden now they're responding. And not only just with pay equity, but also making sure their representation on the boards, women, making sure that we have CEOs now, more CEOs, not enough, but more CEOs of big companies in Boston, which are national companies that are women. All of those things make a difference because women make up 50% of the workforce. So we should share 50% of the CEOs, 50% of the boards, 50% of all the things that we have.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. I think we're moving towards the end of this session. It's sort of flown by, hasn't it? Who can believe it? I've just got a couple of moments to summarize. So I'm going to just see if this is a fair summary of what I think we've been saying. I mean, for me, the real pieces that have come out of today's conversation is that if you take a look at what we were doing at the WEF maybe a decade ago, we didn't have the data that we've got now. And each one of you, in your own way, has described how important it is to collect data on issues like this, and if you can, to make that data public, or at least to have some sort of transparency. So that seems to be really important because that helps people make choices about where they want to work and how they want to work. It seems to me that after all these years, we have a pretty good idea of what best practice is, don't we? I held up before the good work framework. Honestly, it's as good as anything else. I mean, I think we know why people stay at organizations. So the challenge really is not, do we know why they stay? Yes, here it is again. Yes, we do. But how do we actually make it work? And I think what we've heard today is some really interesting observations about the role that the CEO can make, perhaps the role that the sort of structure of the organization can play, the role that government might play, the role that organizations like yours, Joanne, that make a huge difference to how companies interact with various sectors, and of course the importance of data. So I just wanted to say, this being an early session within the WEF week, that this question of skills and talent and labour shortages is something that's coming up right through the week. So I hope that both those of you who are joining us online and those of you who are in the room will continue to think about this important issue, maybe come along to some more sessions, and indeed download and take a look at, there it is, the Good Work Framework. Because actually when we started at the WEF, we didn't know what the Good Work Framework is. I think we all know that now. So that's not, we don't really have to talk about that anymore. I think the sessions that we have now are, how do you make it work? So thank you so much to our panel today to really give us inspiration about how we make it work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.